40 years ago, Christians in South Africa, in their resistance to the sin and scandal of apartheid, drafted the Kairos document, which called upon Christians to discern the signs of the times and act against the injustice of apartheid. What the document did in particular was challenging the church not to succumb to neutrality, because according to the document, neutrality enables the status quo of oppression and therefore violence to continue. Neutrality, the document acknowledged, is a way of giving tacit support to the oppressor. And following on this, a quote that is often attributed to Archbishop Desmond Tutu reiterates this call in a slightly more vivid manner. And according to this quote, and I quote, "If you're neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse, and you say that you are neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality." Complicity with systems and processes of injustice and neutrality in the face of violence continues to be a crisis in our world. Once again, needs to be challenged for its collaboration with and complicity in present-day systems of oppression, domination, and violence. In this webinar, we will do this through exploring some of the prophetic stories, even as Dr. Gamedze will introduce and launch Freedom Theologies, South Africa, an interactive game to engage histories of the South African church's resistance to apartheid. We are really delighted that Dr. Gamedze is with us in person today. So apart from being a poet and an activist, she is also a theologian, a cultural worker, and educator, and is currently based at the University of the Western Cape's Desmond Tutu Centre for Religion and Social Justice as a senior researcher. Thandi, we're really grateful that you're here with us today. So over to you to lead us in this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peniel. It's really wonderful to be here, excuse me, with you. And we are together, even though you can't see us together in the same frame. But I'm here in the USPG offices. So thank you all for being here. It would be wonderful to know who's in the room. So please do go ahead and put that in the comments if you would like. But yes, this is a topic that I'm really passionate about. I think engaging with these histories is really important for thinking about how we see ourselves as the church today and what our role is within, as Peniel said, the current crises that we see today. So I want to start a little bit talking about the Kairos document, as has been mentioned, as a way to kind of frame the role of the church in these times of crises, what it is and maybe what it should be, and then talk a little bit about why we remember these histories and some of the politics of remembering as we think about some of these stories, which I think can enliven the way that we show up as the church today. And then I do want to show this game that I have developed in collaboration with various people, supported by USPG, called Freedom Theologies South Africa, as a way to engage some of the church's role in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, and hopefully to open up some prophetic imagination for how we can engage in the crises of our time as the church. And then I hope we'll have some time for some good discussion. So please, as you think about questions or comments, please Feel free to put them in the chat as you think about them, but also remember them for the end so that we can have some conversation around that. And then at some point, I will ask people to volunteer to read a couple of things if you don't mind. So, so please, if there are some people willing to do that, that would be really great. But let me start a little bit with the Kairos document. And as Peniel said, it's been 40 years since the publishing of the Kairos document in 1985. And 1985 in South Africa was a state of emergency where there were high levels of repression and violence and squashing of any kinds of resistance within the South African context as implemented by the apartheid state. So people were getting arrested, detained, killed, and all kinds of things, and resistance was just being squashed in various ways. And a group of people got together in the township of Soweto to think together and theologically reflect about these times. And in these meetings, frustration was expressed at the church's failure to address these crises in a generative and productive and decisive way. So these frustrations ended up spurring on this process of really deep social analysis and theological engagement with the theologies of the time and the social context. And out of these series of very participatory and dialogical meetings, the Kairos document emerged and was published in September 1985. And I think that it's important that the document was framed as a challenge to the church. So it's got quite a long title, as many such documents maybe have. It's called the Kairos document, and then it kind of has a subtitle, Challenge to the Church. And then, I hope I'm getting this right, but a theological comment on the political crisis in South Africa, something like that. And it really delved into the different theologies that were coming out of the church at the time that were complicit in upholding the injustices of the time, both overtly as well as covertly. And I think it's important for us currently to draw on this legacy because we see various forms of crises around us in our society today. And often the church remains complicit in its theologies and practices in responding to these crises. So I think the document, if you read it today, you might think that it could be written actually to us today. So it's still very relevant, and I think it's really important that we're engaging it in this 40-year anniversary. So I just want to briefly give an overview of the analytical framework that the document provides in terms of what it calls state theology, church theology, and prophetic theology. And then I want to drill a little bit more down into some of the mechanisms through which the church was upholding injustice. And then we'll get into some of the freedom theologies. So basically, in short, state theology referred to the theology that was coming out of the Dutch Reformed Church of the time, which was really the church that was providing the theological basis and justification for the apartheid system and project. So these theologies were almost translated by the apartheid state into the laws and policies of the apartheid system. So in short, state theology was really the overt theological justification of apartheid. Then church theology was slightly more covert. So it was still doing the work of upholding the apartheid system and the various dynamics attached to that, but it did that in a much more undercover way. So in theory and overtly, it said that it thought apartheid was wrong and it shouldn't be with us. But because it didn't recognize the roots of the system of apartheid and really the way that it was functioning as a political and social system, it kind of applied these nice sounding Christian discourses as a sort of plaster over it. So it talked a lot about reconciliation. People must just be reconciled. There mustn't be these divisions, while failing to recognize the deep injustice that was actually holding the system together. And so in that way, it ended up just plastering over the issues that were present. And then the document called the church to a prophetic theology, which read the signs of the times and called the church to something different. So I briefly just want to go into a few of the mechanisms that it talked about within state and church theology, so that we can see the kinds of mechanisms that were actually doing this work of justification of injustice and sanctification of injustice. So the document talks about the way that that state theology appropriated and deployed theological concepts and biblical texts to maintain the unjust status quo. And I'm wanting to pull these out as individual mechanisms, because I think it's important so that we can recognize the ways that these things function today. And I imagine that as I go through some of these things, you'll be able to pinpoint some of how these things are functioning in different contexts today. So it appropriates and deploys theological concepts and scriptures to maintain the status quo. And the example that the Kairos document really drew on in this regard was the use of Romans 13, which was abstracted from its biblical context and then used to make the case that the apartheid state was God ordained, and so it must be accepted. Then it also talks about this idea of the manipulation and spiritualization and deployment of these well-known concepts in order to maintain and perpetuate dominant power relations. So one example that the Kairos document talks about in this regard is the concept of law and order. And so it kind of frames law and order in a very particular way, makes the case that the God-ordained state, and that anyone who acts in defiance of this so-called law and order is Then we see the deployment of certain labels or symbols to create so these labels are kind of deployed to create an often fictional enemy that fear can be stirred up around and against. So one of the examples in this regard, under the apartheid state, anyone who was against apartheid for whatever reason and in any way was labeled a communist. So these people were just purely demonized and invalidated in various ways through these labels. And I think we see these things functioning today in various ways as well. Then also the delegitimization of the faith of anyone who challenges the oppressive status quo. So because apartheid was very theologically underpinned, it was also theologically challenged in various ways through Black theology and liberation theology and other forms of contextual theologies. But anyone who challenged the apartheid state was labeled an atheist, so their faith was delegitimized, and therefore they were said not to be able to say anything that could be taken seriously against the state. And then you see the deployment of the name of God to back and justify any actions of the state. You see it being used in the apartheid constitution. So everything that the state does is shown to be sanctified by God and divinely ordained. And then within church theology, you see the uncritical use of absolute principles devoid of any social analysis, which act to justify the status quo. So you see, I mentioned before, the idea of reconciliation or forgiveness, peace, unity, these concepts which, because they are not rooted in an analysis of the real conditions, they just act to plaster over and justify. And then this idea which kind of reduces these systemic and structural injustices to individual people and relations. And so this kind of theory of change is put forward as individual conversions in response to these issues that are actually very much structural. And then again, I think as Peniel mentioned before, this attempt to appear neutral and apolitical, and this idea that actually this is what is asked of us at the church, as the church, when of course we know that that in a moment of oppression there is no neutral, there is no apolitical, and so the choice to be silent and pretend to be neutral is of course a political choice. And then incorrect diagnoses of the problem because there's no social analysis. And then this idea of spirituality as otherworldly, as private, as individualistic, as opposed to really rooted in the here and now and the material conditions of the here and now. So then this was contrasted with the document, what the document referred to as prophetic theology. And I'll just kind of give a short overview of some of the characteristics of prophetic theology as spelled out in the document. And then we'll get into this work of actually remembering some of these histories as examples, I think, of prophetic theology within the anti-apartheid movement. So according to the document, prophetic theology understands that real change and true justice comes from below. So even the way that the Kairos document was developed was very participatory. It wasn't top-down or hierarchical. It actually called its own process of doing theology people's theology, because it wasn't just priests. There were priests involved, but it was also lay people and people from all kinds of levels of society. Then there's a deep, and I think this is really central, a deep commitment to social analysis or reading the signs of the times, or as someone I recently met put it, naming the moment. I really like that. And then from this deep social analysis and this naming the moment, there's a commitment to naming and resisting the structures of oppression. And I think structures is important because it is in a structural sense. So it doesn't reduce these structural and systemic issues to, it doesn't individualize these issues. And then it takes a firm and concrete stance in this regard. So it speaks out against any fence-sitting or guise of neutrality, but it invites the church to take a position. It talks about refusing to legitimize an illegitimate regime. It understands scripture as a tool to resist oppression. And in line with this, it reads scripture with what Gutierrez calls a preferential option for the poor. So read scripture from the sites of oppression, from the sites of struggle and towards liberation for the most marginalized. It's unafraid to name powers as what it calls tyrannical or illegitimate or evil or against God. It's aimed towards a common good for all people and a hope for a different future, or an imagination for a new world, which I think is a really important piece of this puzzle. So it's not only naming and doing analysis of what's present, but it's also creating this prophetic imagination for a different kind of future, a future that God dreams of for all of God's people and creation. And then in that, there's always a call to action. Action is always a central part of prophetic theology. So action towards this different kind of future. So in this regard, we'll go on to engage a little bit with some of the histories of prophetic theology that came out of South Africa. And just a few thoughts, I think, before we go into those examples around this idea of remembering. I think remembering, talked about there's no such thing as neutrality, and I think there's no such thing as neutrality in the way that we remember as well. And I think this is very present within some of the ways that the church's struggle against apartheid is remembered. Because today, often churches will speak about this as if they played a very central role in the anti-apartheid struggle from the beginning. Whereas actually that's an inaccurate reading of history. And in a lot of cases, the church had to actually be dragged along, often kicking and screaming. And I think there's an importance to remembering some of these things accurately, because we see these similar tendencies today. And I think if we can remember accurately or faithfully and engage with these things faithfully, we have more of a chance of recognizing some of our blind spots, our weaknesses as the church, and doing better the next time. And then even in my work to kind of delve into and make accessible these histories that have often been marginalized, because sometimes I think the way that these things are remembered is with very broad strokes. So it will be the church was involved in the liberation struggle, but some of the finer details of this are really absent from a lot of our church discourse. I didn't know about the Kairos document for many years, and I've been in the church my whole life. Many of the histories that I write about in this game that we're going to engage with a little bit, I hadn't at all come across in my time at the church, and came across, in little bits and pieces in things that I was reading. And I think it's really important to remember well and remember deeply and remember faithfully. And so this is some of the work that I'm hoping to do through this game, because I think these stories can awaken and enliven and catalyze new moments and new stories of resistance and faithful action in response to the crises that we see today. So I am going to share my screen and maybe some people can get ready to read. We're going to need 6 people altogether to read. And I hope there's some people who will be willing. So this is the cover of the game. It's called Freedom Theologies South Africa. And my dear friend, Zach Stewart, did these beautiful illustrations that you'll see more of. And I won't go into explaining the game in full, but I think you'll see it as it goes on. And if you have any questions, we can engage with that as we go. Would anyone be open to reading this first card on the Institute for Contextual Theology? If you would, please feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead. And I want to, so on one side, there's the card and the information, and on the back of the card is what makes a timeline in the end. I heard someone unmute. Please go ahead.
Okay, I'll volunteer.
Thank you.
The Institute of Contextual Theology, ICT, was established in 1982 as an ecumenical organization seeking to nurture the church's prophetic praxis in response to apartheid. The ICT's first director was Frank Chikane, a minister of the Apostolic Faith Mission, disowned by the denomination due to his activism, with deep roots in the Black consciousness movement. The ICT was deeply committed to the development of contextual theology that in both content and methodology centered the experience of those bearing the brunt of systematic oppression. It was also committed to challenging the South African Church to act in accordance with its mandate for social justice. These commitments were embodied in the ICT's work in facilitating the development and publishing of the Kairos document in 1985. This process involves several gatherings to collectively reflect on the church's role in the present crisis and develop a prophetic theology and call to action in response.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Yes, so this is the institute that facilitated that process that I was explaining a little bit in 1985, where people got together and engaged the times and developed this Kairos document. So in the game, one person would have this card, and then everyone would have, sorry, it's not moving along. There we go. Then everyone would have a bingo board. It's kind of based on a bingo methodology. And so if you can see it, one of these blocks relates to the Institute for Contextual Theology. So maybe you can look through all of these clues and either unmute yourself and say if you think you see the one that relates to the Institute for Contextual Theology, or you can write it in the chat. But have a look through these blocks and feel free to share if you think you've got it. Yeah, I see something in the chat. Okay, no, that's someone introducing themselves. Any takers? Anyone wants to guess? So in the actual game, I wish we could play it, but unfortunately haven't yet figured out a way to do that online. But if we were playing in person, each person would have one of the cards and one of these boards, and you would go around and interact and then fill in the answers to all of these things on this board. So anyone see the possible answer? Which block should it be filled into? Maybe I should just give you this one to show you. Feel like there's no takers. Okay, so this one, oh, we have
into the writing of the Kairos document.
Yes, there we go. Thank you. Well done. Okay, so you'd write it in there, the institute, so the organization which facilitated the writing of the Kairos document. Great. Then do we have a taker to read the next card, the Black Christ?
Okay, I'll read. This is Deepak from India.
Thank you.
The Black Christ is a 1962 painting by Ronald Harrison. It centrally features a black Jesus on the cross, painted in the likeness of struggle activist Albert Luthuli. On the left, crucifying Jesus, are two Roman soldiers resembling apartheid architect Henrik Verwoerd and former Minister of Justice John Worston. On the right are, in Harrison's words, a colored Madonna and an ancient St. John. Harrison created this painting in response to the violent repression of the apartheid government at the time that 2 years prior had manifested in the Sharpeville massacre, in which 69 unarmed protesters were shot and killed by state police. The painting provided a creative and sharp critique of the apartheid state, using its own framework of Christianity as the basis. It challenged the apartheid theology, in which God was understood to support white supremacy, and in the tradition of liberation theology, emphasized God siding with the oppressed.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. This painting is actually now in one of the museums in Cape Town. The person, Ronald Harrison, comes from a suburb in Cape Town, and actually in Salt River, which is the place where he was from, they have now created a mural, some street art, with the painting of the Black Christ. And my friend Zach, so the painting, you can go and look for it, but it's quite similar, but Zach did a kind of recreation of it here. So then again, we move to the board. If anyone sees the block that the Black Christ should be in, feel free to shout out or put it in the chat.
A 1962 painting which challenged apartheid?
Yes, wonderful. Thank you. Okay, and we'll just engage with, I think I've got six examples of this here for you to engage, but there's 16 in the actual game. But I just pulled out a few. Is there anyone who would be open to reading the next one out? And please forgive me for the very long sentence in this. I really like long sentences, even though I should rein myself in sometimes.
The Woodstock theses were a collection of 95 theses which highlighted and challenged racism, specifically in the Anglican Church. These emerged out of a Christian Institute organized conference in the Western Cape theme around the church and race relations in South Africa, in a symbolic reenactment of the events precipitating the Reformation on 31 October 1517. On the night of 31 October 1960, a group of Anglicans led by a priest of the senior church in Cape Town, the seat of the Anglican Archbishop, and nailed a document containing the 95 theses to the main door. While the critique was primarily addressed internally to the Anglican Church, it posed a decisive challenge to the South African Church more broadly, forcing it to recognize and reckon with the racism present within its own institutions.
Thank you so much. I really like this example because, for many reasons. I think I live quite close to Woodstock, so it's a very familiar space, and I know St. George's Cathedral well. That's actually the cathedral that Archbishop Desmond Tutu was in for a number of years. And also, I think there's something very powerful of this. It's almost like it feels like a performance piece in a way, and draws on this other history. So you see echoes of that, and so it almost evokes this other memory of something else, and then is addressing what was a present crisis. And I think it's very powerful that it was addressing these realities within its own church structures, had external ramifications and challenges as well. So that is the Woodstock theses. And then here we go again. So does anyone see the block that it relates to? Looking for it myself. Feel free to shout it out or post in the chat.
An initiative to address the racism in the Anglican Church in 1967.
Yes, yay. I know I'm making you work on a Friday afternoon, so. Okay, the next one, do we have a taker to read about the Black Priest Solidarity Group?
The Black Priest Solidarity Group, led by Father Libamang Sibidi, was formed in 1976 by Black Catholic clergy in Joburg. The BPSG grew out of the Black consciousness movement, understanding itself as the theological leader of BC. Its aim to collectively study and reflect on Black theology and its implications for the Church. The BPSG later expanded into a multi-denominational network of church leaders who intervened in social justice issues on behalf of the various communities they served. The network was renamed Ministers United for Christian Co-Responsibility in 1983, with Reverend John Lamula, its last serving secretary from 1986 to 1988. The BPSG was a small but powerful group with widespread popular support, and because of this was feared by the traditional church authorities. The BPSG understood its work as instilling in black clergy a commitment to the gospel of liberation and to the cause of the oppressed.
Thank you so much. I really like this, and I love the picture that Zach drew for this one. And I wanted to pull this one out particularly because I know that I think many of you are priests or within those spaces, and so I thought this kind of organizing as this group of priests committed to justice is a really powerful history and powerful example. Let us move on to the board and shout if you see the block. Okay, there we go. It's there in the corner, so it's usually the last one that you would see. But a group started by Catholic clergy in 1976. So you can also see, I think, the range of denominational origins of these histories and the different levels, the different audiences that they were aimed at in a way. So I wanted to provide a bit of a range. This is the next one. I think there's just one more after this. Would anyone like to read this one, the Young Christian Workers?
The Young Christian Workers Initiative was a working class movement birthed from the Catholic Church. YCM was initially founded in Belgium in 1919. The South African chapter began in Johannesburg in 1949, expanding quickly to the other sites and leading to the emergence of some early workers' union. The YCM created space for workers to reflect theologically, and they lived the experience, and out of this, to plan and execute strategic action related to workers' rights, just labor practices, and social justice more broadly. The movement was organized into sections, small groups of workers that met regularly to reflect and shape their collective practices. YCMW initiated the See, Judge, Act methodology, a three-stage reflective process involving recognizing and analyzing the context, critically engaging scripture in the conversation with the context, and strategizing and planning for actions around this. This methodology has since been adopted by many traditions of liberation theological worldwide.
Thank you. I found this so fascinating because many people, I imagine, are aware with the See, Judge, Act methodology. So I was really interested to find that, and I hope I'm not proven wrong in this. I read it in a reputable source, but that it emerged from this initiative and has been taken up by many traditions of liberation theology. And I also appreciated this example because it shows the connections, the transnational connections, the connections between different contexts in these different actions and these different movements, which I appreciated. Okay, so if anyone sees it, I'll just give a few seconds and then I will.
The organization which initiated the See, Judge, Act methodology.
Amazing, thank you. Okay, and let's go on to our last one. Do we have a taker to read this for us, the CI Agape?
The CI Agape was a weekly fellowship meal established by Director of the Christian Institute's Cape Chapter, Thandi Gamedze, in partnership with his wife, Helen Coates. This meal embodied many of the central values and commitments of the CI and was an important source of both physical and spiritual sustenance for those who shared in it. It began with collective liturgy, which surfaced, named, and engaged with the context, pointed to important sources of hope, and engaged with actions with which the CI was involved. The liturgy also included prayer for those on the margins of society, for the church, and for the government. The meal served as an important site for discussion, information exchange, and coordination of strategic anti-apartheid action. In addition to the weekly meal, the Cape CI's town office was used as a regular eating and meeting space in which people across racial groups, class positions, and faith traditions could gather.
Thank you so much. I really like this as well because I think all good things happen over food. And so it's a really great example about how food was intentionally thought about as a political as well as a spiritual space, which could nourish and enliven and animate different actions towards a world which embodied more justice. Okay, here is the last one. Should be very easy. I mean, these aren't meant to be difficult. People go around with the boards and speak to each other and fill them in, and then the goal is to try and fill in all the blocks and then have some discussion about it. There we go. We see the weekly meal initiated by the Cape director of the Christian Institute. And that, then this is just a quick one to show you then how a timeline then can be created from these different cards. So on the back is the timeline. So the Young Christian Workers is first, then the Black Christ in 62, the Woodstock Theses in 67, the CI Agape in 69, the Black Priest Solidarity Group in 76, and the Institute of Contextual Theology in 82. And that is our timeline. Thank you. That is where I'll stop. I would love to hear some questions and comments and discussion.
Thank you, Thandi. I really want to thank you profusely for the way in which you have introduced us to the South African Church's responses to and resistance to apartheid, and also for this excellent resource that you have produced in collaboration with Zach. This is an excellent teaching aid, and if people want to introduce liberation theologies from South Africa, this is something that you can always use.